Greetings, podcast listeners. Welcome to another episode of my podcast on Mussolini's Italy. So, in this episode, I'll be speaking about repression in Fascist Italy. This includes his repression of the Jews, political opposition, and the population of Italy in general. In the end, I'll be discussing how effective his methods of repression were. To begin with, how were Jews repressed in Fascist Italy? Mussolini implemented laws relating to immigration, employment, personal lives, and education. Essentially, he systematically imposed anti-Semitic laws of varying degrees that oppressed the Italian Jewish population, restricting their rights to employment, property, and education. And now a few of these policies are: 1. All Jews who had arrived in Italy after 1919 were given 6 months to leave. This meant that Jews who had fled from the Nazi German regime had to relocate again. 2. Jewish property was confiscated and Jews were not allowed to be managers of businesses that employed in excess of 100 workers. 3. Marriages between Jews and Italians were forbidden. 4. State employment was denied to Jews, so many people were dismissed, such as Jewish Italian teachers. 5th, a Charter of Race was issued in 1938 to give a scientific explanation of the fascist racial doctrine. And finally, foreign Jews were banned from Italian schools. Now on to how did Mussolini repress political opposition? One of the methods was the Law for Defense of the State from 1926. A special tribunal for the defense of the state was set up by military officers. They were in charge of putting fascist political opponents on trial. Following their trial, those convicted would be imprisoned on remote islands. 31 death penalties were issued by them, including the leader of the Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci, and liberals Piero Gobetti and Giovanni Amendola. This paved the way for the establishment of OVRA in 1927. The Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, OVRA, was established in 1927. This organization was a secret police force in the Kingdom of Italy. Their job was to stop any anti-fascist activity and eliminate anti-fascist sentiment. They were responsible for investigations and ensuring the safety of the Jews from those who wanted to kill him. They used terror to scare the Italian population into obeying and stopping them from speaking out against the fascist party. They were known to persecute a number of groups, including the Jews, Gypsies, and homosexuals. With their operations, they arrested around 4,000 people and 10 were executed. Censorship and propaganda were heavily practiced in Fascist Italy. These were targeted at the general public to ensure full cooperation, journalists and editors to ensure a good image of Fascist Italy was consistently portrayed, and anti-fascists and government officials, which would ensure that there was no opposition to the fascist government or Mussolini's leadership. In regards to the media, in July 1925, new laws were introduced controlling the press. Anti-fascist newspapers were closed down. Legally, now any articles had to be approved by the government before being published, and in December 1925, it was required that all journalists would be registered with the Fascist Party. With this, hostile journalists and editors were replaced or arrested, whilst those approved by the fascists remained. The Ministry of Popular Culture had competence over the contents in newspapers, radio, art, etc. Most foreign papers were banned, and state controlled what the media published and portrayed. With this, the reporting of crime, disasters, and disorders were forbidden, to ensure that a good image of Fascist Italy was being portrayed. Coming with the censorship, there was also an extreme loss of privacy. Private calls and letters were intercepted and monitored. This allowed them to root out any anti-fascist sentiment and underground opposition. Censorship was to be carried out by prefects, but in the case of the media, the editors, which were approved by the fascists, usually performed this task successfully without the involvement of prefects. The Public Security Law of 1926 was put in practice with strict control over the state, aiming to reduce political opposition. Italian associations, bodies, and institutes, and by extension the whole Italian population, were required to provide their details when requested by public security authorities. The Public Security Law allowed investigations into threats of public security. Those found to be enemies of the state were to be sentenced to harsh imprisonment and faced the death penalty, which had been reintroduced. This public security law would be supported by Italians, and especially those who feared communism. The Vidoni Palace Pact was signed in October 1925 between the General Confederation of Italian Industry, called Confindustria, which is the Italian Employers' Federation and National Chamber of Commerce, and jointly with Rossini's fascist trade unions. It limited the organizations which represented workers to the official fascist ones, as it abolished the Catholic, Socialist, and Independent workers and trade unions. Workers were instructed not to challenge the authority of their employers and managers. This matched with the fascist ideology of anti-individualism and resulted in a loss of freedoms and rights. Finally, Alfredo Rocco's law on corporations came into effect in October 1926. Trade unions were banned, and a new law court was set up to deal with political offences. The law also made all strikes illegal. With this, the National Council of Corporations was initially established by royal decree on the 2nd of July, 1926. This law on corporations aligned with the fascist ideology of anti-individualism and contributing to the state, and resulted in a loss of freedoms and rights of workers all over Italy. Now, how effective was Mussolini's repression? Many political opponents fled Italy, including Francesco Nitti, who was Prime Minister from 1919 to 1920, and Sturzo, who founded the Italian People's Party. Cases about political opponents reached an average of about 2,000 a year, and there were in total 9 executions until 1940. In total, 5,000 out of 28,000 opponents were imprisoned or banished. In 1926, 21,000 people were put on trial. From 1927 to 1937, 3,596 sentences were passed, totaling 15,300 years. Thus, the average sentence was approximately 5 years. Over the duration of his rule, it is estimated that Mussolini had around 2,000 political opponents killed, and there were 7,000 Italian Jews who were murdered by the fascist regime. Many opponents of the fascists fled into exile. Those who did not, and even some who tried to, were killed by fascist agents. An important figure was Carlo Roselli. He was one of the founders of Justice and Liberty, a group that aimed to unite all political opponents of the fascists, excluding communists. The members publicly dropped anti-fascist pamphlets from aeroplanes, and the leaders were arrested as a result. Roselli was fortunate enough to escape, and edited the anti-fascist journal from Paris. However, he was eventually assassinated by Mussolini's agents. All in all, Mussolini's repressive actions contributed to a huge success. He was able to intimidate the population in order to gain their support. Around 2,000 people were killed by the state for political reasons, although this is a small number in comparison to the Italian population and those killed by Hitler's Gestapo. This shows that Mussolini was effective in establishing control. There were no mass killings, and the number of people killed was relatively low. This therefore demonstrates that he had control over the country, and therefore he had no need to kill large numbers of people. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of my podcast. Please click subscribe to be notified when the next episode is released. You may also use the links in the description of this episode to visit my website, which contains additional revision materials, and also links to my social media pages and to a Google form where you can review my podcast and leave me valuable feedback. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.